So today we're going to dive in on the book How Leaders Learn. So this book is written by David Novak, and David Novak was the CEO of Yum Brands for nearly 2 decades and had a super interesting career. And I think we're going to have a lot of lessons to learn from David about how to rise up through the ranks within an organization. So David had a super interesting career. As a kid, he actually grew up in a trailer park. He calls himself a trailer park kid, and I believe it was 23 states that he lived in before he was even in high school. So he was moving around all the time, does not come from a background of privilege, never had an Ivy League, MBA, or anything like that, which is common among executive leaders in these large Fortune 500 organizations. So I think today we're going to go over 9 lessons that I took away from this book. That, like I said, it's just great lessons if you're someone who's in an organization and trying to understand how you can more effectively help your team, help the organization win, so that you can move up through the ranks in your career. So a little bit about Yum. So Yum was split out, or I guess was originated by being split out from PepsiCo, and it was the parent company of brands like Pizza Hut, KFC, Taco Bell, and Habit Burger. When he left, and I want to say it was 2016, it had over 41,000 restaurants across the country. He shares a ton of great stories in the book. I'm definitely just hitting the wave tops of just a few of the stories in it. So definitely get the book. There's a ton of good stuff in there. One fun story we'll touch on is in his career, one of his ideas made the Times Magazine list of the 100 worst ideas of the century. So we'll dive in on that. And yeah, like I said, get the book. We're going to go through 9 lessons that I took away from the book, and we'll get rolling. So with that, lesson number 1 is keep things simple. So actually towards the end of the book, David tells a story about how when he was 25 years old, he was working at a marketing agency, and he would be preparing these memos for his bosses or for his boss, and he would go through 6 or 7 iterations of his boss telling him to make it more simple, make it more simple, make it more simple before he got to that final deliverable. And I really enjoyed that story because it resonated with so many things that I've heard from other folks, right? About the importance of keeping things simple. I think about Jocko in his book, Extreme Ownership. He has 4 laws of combat, and the second one is simple. On his podcast with Tim Ferriss, Tim Ferriss asks him, hey, what are you world class at? And Jocko says, first off, he prefaces with, I don't think I'm world class at anything. But then he explains that if he had to pick something, he thinks one of the things is being able to take complex problems and break them down and communicate them simply, right? This is another thing that I've heard from Warren Buffett, right? Warren Buffett says business schools reward difficult, complex behavior more than simple behavior, but simple behavior is more effective, right? There's so many places, if you look throughout history, that emphasize how being simple is more effective than being complicated. Steve Jobs, simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean and to make it simple, but it's worth it in the end because once you get there, you can move mountains, right? And that's what this story is reminding me of. It takes effort to get down to the simple core of whatever the idea you're working on is. And I wanted to highlight this lesson first because it's one of the earliest stories from David's career. Now, he does talk about how he was cleaning bathrooms and had other jobs during like high school and college, but really in his career at the marketing agency, this is the one story in the book that he references during his time there. I believe I may be missing another one, but that story focused on him learning how to simplify and understanding the importance of simplifying things. And so I just love that because I think it's interesting that it's one of the earliest lessons from his career. And I think that lays the foundation for where he's going to go and how he can simplify how he interfaces with everybody that he's working with. So like I said, that's lesson one. Keep it simple. I just loved how that was one of the foundational lessons for him early on in his career. Now, lesson number two is calibrating your expectations. This actually comes from that same story, right? He's talking about how he would repeatedly have to edit these memos 6 or 7 times before he got the clearance or the go ahead from his boss to move it forward and move forward with that deliverable. Now, the reason this is important is because I know early on for me in my career, I had a similar thing happen where it would take me many iterations to get to a final product. And when I was in that seat, I felt like it was too much. I felt like my bosses or the people that I was trying to communicate with, I thought it was on their and I thought it was their fault that they weren't understanding the ideas that I was trying to communicate. When in reality, it just takes that many iterations to actually take your idea and simplify it down. And so being able to calibrate your expectations to understand, okay, how many times am I going to need to go through this process in order to get to the outcome, making sure you calibrate that so you don't get frustrated in the middle of executing that process. One story that I love, that's kind of an analogy here, Alex Hormozy talks about setting the correct expectations all the time. And he tells this story about how he had this mentor who owned like 20 gyms or something. And Alex was trying to grow in the space, right? He was opening gyms and he was trying to be successful. And so he asked this mentor what he did to get more leads. And the mentor said that flyers and putting physical flyers out was a really effective tactic for him. So Alex Hormozy goes out. I think he puts about 300 flyers out in a neighborhood, and it doesn't really get too much traction. And so his mentor comes back to him and asks, hey, how did it go? And Alex says, well, it didn't really work out that well. And the mentor says, well, wait, how many did you put out there? And Alex tells him 300. And the mentor says, hey, my test sample size is 5,000. And then whenever we do find whichever one we're going to run with, we do 5,000 a day, right? And so I love that story because it talks about just calibrating your expectations and understanding the volume that it takes to get the results that you want. And I think this story emphasizing, hey, that it would take 6 or 7 times. And this wasn't one instance that he mentions on, hey, there was this one time where I went through 6 or 7 iterations. He says whenever he was making memos, it would constantly be 6 or 7 repetitions before he would get it approved, right? So making sure that we set our expectations to understand the volume of work that we're going to need to do to get to that result that we want, right? So we just want to calibrate our expectations there. Another story actually here was something I heard from Jordan Peterson. He talks about calibrating your expectations for interviews. And he mentions, and this resonated with me because I had this challenge. Jordan Peterson talks about whenever you are applying for jobs and you're out there on the job search, you need to calibrate how many resumes you're going to need to send out, how many interviews you're going to need to do before landing a job. And I think he sets the baseline at like 100 interviews just to get one job. And when I heard that from Jordan Peterson, it resonated with me because when I was in college, I was interviewing for internships. And between my freshman, sophomore, and early on in my junior year of college, between all those, I want to say it was somewhere between 15 and 20 interviews for internships, and I was rejected for every single one of them. And 2 of those rejections were from the same company, which my dad worked for. And my dad was trying to help me get a job. So, and I remember being in that seat at the time of like, how could I possibly be so bad? I had a good GPA at the time. I had friends that had lower GPAs than me that were being successful getting internships. And I just remember sitting there thinking like, I've applied to so many jobs. I've had so many interviews, yet I don't have an internship. And in reality, my expectations were just wildly off. I had done 15 or 20 of them, but I needed to do way more. And there were other problems too. I needed to change how I approached interviews and other things like that. But a big part of it was I needed to calibrate my expectations for how many reps at this thing I needed to do before I became effective at it. So that was lesson number 2 from that same story, is just calibrating your expectations and making sure you have those set correctly so you don't get frustrated as you're going through the process. All right. Lesson number 3 from the book is failure is part of the journey. So I'm not going to cover a lot of them, but David has some great stories in here about times where he's failed throughout his career. One of them is a story about Crystal Pepsi. So at the time, David's 40 years old. So you got to think about this. He's already 18-ish plus years into his career. He's made it to be the chief marketing officer of PepsiCo's beverage division. And during this time, colas were the craze. He's talking about how alternative beverages like Snapple and other flavored waters were the hot commodity. And so he comes up with this idea for what he calls Crystal Pepsi, which is essentially just a clear version of Pepsi. And he pitches it to his boss and some of the board members, and those folks don't really like his idea, but they let him run with it because he has the trust with them. And so he goes through with it and then ends up essentially being a flop. It's not a complete flop because I don't think it ends up losing them a ton of money, but he at the time really thinks it's going to be a career maker for him, and ends up SNL has a skit making fun of it. This is the idea where later, I think it's about a decade later, he says that Time magazine actually lists it as one of the 100 worst ideas of the century. And that story, reminded me of other, failures that I've read about, learned about from other leaders, right? I think about Steve Jobs getting kicked out of Apple in 1985. I think about Jocko Willink in his book Extreme Ownership. He talks about the blue on blue that he had in Ramadi in 2006, right? And that was early on in his deployment. His platoon ends up becoming one of the most decorated SEAL platoons in the history of the SEAL teams. Yet early on in that deployment, he had one of the worst things in combat, which is a blue on blue, which means essentially friendly fire, where he had his own guys shooting at each other. So I love that David highlights in there, failure is a part of the journey. He has a meteoric rise in his career through these organizations, and all along the way, he has plenty of failures that he has. And like I said, this one with the Crystal Pepsi story happened when he was 40 years old, right? He wasn't a new guy. He was experienced. He had a lot of experience at that point, yet he was still putting himself in situations where sometimes he was going to fail. And just remembering that failure is part of the journey when you are trying to do your best to help out an organization. So that was lesson number 3 from the book for me. Lesson number 4 is move toward the problems. He says in the book, most of my career moves reflect a theme. I took jobs with organizations that were experiencing trouble. Those might seem like jobs to avoid, but I never felt that way. When you become responsible for a team or a company at the top of its game, your job is don't screw it up. That always sounded harder or scarier than find a way to fix the problems. I like fixing problems. In fact, fixing one problem after another at PepsiCo led me to my dream job at Yum, which was being the CEO. And so if you get the book, you'll read as he takes over the job of being COO, as he becomes the president of KFC and Taco Bell, he encounters problem after problem after problem, and he just dives in on them and does everything that he can to fix those problems, right? And one thing I wanted to highlight, and I'm sure David touches on it in here, but you don't want to be moving toward the problems for the sake of getting the promotion, right? You want to be moving toward the problem because it's an important problem that, if fixed, is going to help the team and it's going to help the company, right? That's why you want to move toward those problems. And that's something that I think is important to remember. You don't want to attack the problems for the sake of getting the promotion. You want to attack the problems because it's what's best for the team, right? And I think this relates to something that I read from William McCraven, who was the, I think, 4-star admiral in the SEAL teams, led the Special Operations Command, was the leader for Operation Neptune Spear, which was killing Osama bin Laden. If you don't know about McRaven, go read about him. He's an awesome guy, but he wrote a book called The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, and that's one of his leadership books. And in that book, he has a chapter called Run to the Sound of the Guns. And it's talking about this exact thing. When you see problems, as a leader, you want to move toward those problems. You want to be default aggressive and go attack the problems that are in your way, right? So I think that ties in exactly to what David does throughout his entire career. Whenever there's problems within the organization, David is moving toward those problems. He's not running from them. And as he tackles problem after problem after problem, that's what ends up helping him or propelling him through his career up the ranks within the organization. So, like I said, that was lesson number 4, move toward the problems. Lesson number 5 is stack undeniable proof. So this story is essentially kind of at a point in his career where David knows that he eventually wants to become the president of a PepsiCo division, right? So PepsiCo has, if I remember correctly, there's 3 divisions. There's the beverage, the snacks, and the restaurants. And so he wants to end up being a president of one of those divisions. But at the time, his entire career has been marketing. Right? And so he's trying to advocate for himself to step into a COO position because he knows that's the trajectory that he needs to hop on in order to become a president and be leading one of the divisions. And so he talks about how he's trying to convince, I think it's Wayne Calloway, who's the chairman of the entire PepsiCo division, as well as his boss. And diving in on the book, he says, "It helped that I made an offer that I hoped they couldn't refuse. Give me the position for 6 months, and if you don't think I'm doing a great job, I'll go back and do anything you want me to do in marketing. No hard feelings, no questions asked. You can even fire me if you want to. I was taking charge of my career, and I think they both respected that." So he goes in there. He knows that this is the career. He knows he needs to make a move in order to get where he wants to get to. And so he's essentially taking a gamble on himself and saying, hey, give me the position. If I'm messing it up in 6 months, you can get rid of me. Right? And so then later he goes on to say, "I'm not sure I could have told you this is what I was doing at the time, but one cognitive reappraisal technique I was using is called examining the evidence, which is a way to combat our inclination to focus on the negative with facts, with reality, with proof. Objectively, I had ample proof that I could succeed. While I didn't have operations experience, I knew our industry, our customers, and the problems we were facing. I also had years of leadership and experience stepping into dramatically different challenges and tackling hard to crack problems. The evidence offered more support for my success than my failure, even if my brain wanted me to doubt it." All right, so then David goes on later to say, every time you step into a new challenge and succeed, you're collecting evidence that you can use to convince yourself to tackle the next challenge. Pretty soon, it gets less uncomfortable and becomes a habit. All right, so this reminded me of another thing that I hear from Alex Hormozy, and I know a lot of people have talked about it over the time. But you want to stack up evidence that you are capable of solving problems, right? And so David here, he's talking about, hey, yes, I've been in marketing, but first off, marketing is very broad. There's a ton of different marketing and leadership challenges that I have tackled throughout my career. And that gives me the confidence to know that, hey, if I move into this new role with new challenges and new problems, I can be successful there because I've done that many times in the past, right? So just stacking that undeniable proof throughout your career of, hey, I've done these things before. I've gone into scenarios where I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know the answer going into it, but I know how to dive into those situations and come out the other side. And confidence doesn't come from, just thinking that you're capable of doing something. It comes from stacking up that evidence throughout your career, throughout your life, to show yourself that you can get into these situations. So I think of it as stacking undeniable proof. And David calls it here examining the evidence, right? He's examining the evidence of his past, and he sees that he's been successful diving into problems that he wasn't sure how to solve. He's done it many times before. This is just another step along that journey for him. So that's lesson number 5. Diving in on lesson number 6, the answers are in other people's head. So for this one, I'm actually going to dive into a story that David tells from the book. So he ends up getting that job being the COO of Pepsi's beverage division. And when he starts in that job, one of the first things he does is go to one of the lowest performing bottling plants, which is in Baltimore. So diving in on the book, he says, I met with the sales and manufacturing teams and asked straight out what's working and what needs to be fixed. They replied nothing and everything. They weren't used to having executives ask their opinions, but when I encouraged them to elaborate and then shut my mouth, they had plenty to say for 2 straight hours. It takes trucks forever to get out of here. The fountain guys don't get the equipment they need. The place is filthy. It was a real airing of grievances, and it was clear that the leaders had created a culture of complaining rather than active learning. That's something Jocko would call lack of ownership. But I kept listening. I saw problems too, but I resisted the urge to jump in because under their complaints were a host of good ideas. The longer they talked, the longer I listened, the more ideas came to the surface. Finally, one man said, okay, you don't seem like such a bad guy. What are you going to do about all this? I'm not going to do a damn thing, I said. They looked at me like I was crazy. You know the problems better than anyone, so you should know the best way to fix them. Then I asked the plant manager to join us. I had intentionally not included him before. These people have a lot of good ideas, I said, and I want you to work with them. I'm coming back in 6 months to see the progress, and when I do, I want to see all the people who are here now back in this room. The day I returned, the workers practically poured out the front door to greet me. They couldn't wait to show me all the improvements they had made, especially the changes they had implemented to make the truck loading process more efficient. The place wasn't perfect, but it was much better than it had been. They were so proud of what they had accomplished, the problems they had solved, the ideas they executed, and I was proud of them too. All of that happened because I listened. All right. So I said the lesson number 6 was the answers are in other people's heads. So we can see in this story, right? We talked about he's moving into this COO role. He's now in operations. He's been in marketing his entire career. Operations is something new for him, and he's diving into this problem at a bottling plant. And how is he going to approach that? He's not approaching it with, hey, I'm going to go figure out the solution to all these problems myself. He knows when he goes in that the people on the front lines are going to have the answers in their heads. At another part in the book, David says, in my experience as an active learner, I've noticed that people aren't always good at coming to you with ideas for improvement, but they are good at telling you what is frustrating them. That's how you uncover problems that need solving. Another quote from the book, most good ideas are out there, either in practice or in somebody's head. And David talking about this and this story in particular reminded me of a lesson I learned from Kat Cole. And she was on an interview. I believe the podcast was The Skinny Confidential. Believe it or not, it's a podcast that my wife turned me on to. But on that, she says, people close to the action know what the right move to be taken is long before the leader takes the step. They may not have the language to articulate it clearly and don't have the authority, but they have a piece. And so this lesson of the answers are in other people's head. In this story, and even in Kat Cole's example, yes, they are the higher ups in the chain of command and they're leading down. But I think this principle of understanding that the answer is in other people's heads applies whether you're at the bottom of the chain of command, in the middle, or at the top, right? No matter where you are, the answers to so many problems are with the people who are on the front lines. They're with the people who are attacking those problems. And to get to those answers, if you're in a space where you are not the expert, you need to go to those people on the front line to find the answers. And I love what Kat Cole said has stuck with me. You need to realize like they may not be able to articulate exactly what the problem is. That's your job as the leader, as the quarterback of the person who's trying to solve that problem to figure out. And that ties into lesson number 7 from the book, which is get good at asking questions, right? So if the answer lies in other people's heads, we as the leaders need to get good at asking questions to get those answers out. I love this analogy from Tim Ferriss. He calls questions, he thinks of it as a pickaxe, right? So one of the things Tim Ferriss says is, if you want to get anything in life, chances are it's in someone else's head. The knowledge, the skills, the blueprint. And the pickaxe for getting that gold is in the form of questions, right? So whenever you're diving into these situations, this story with David going to Baltimore, going to this bottling plant, he knows that he's not the one with the answers, so he's got to ask questions to get those answers out of folks' heads. And now, I'd be curious if I had the chance to talk to David. I'm sure he asks the question, what's working and what needs to be fixed, and he talks about how the guys start pouring things out, but I guarantee you he probably digs in with more well-aimed questions to start picking apart certain problems and potential solutions for those problems throughout that conversations. And another thing that David says in the book, a quote from him says, active learners know that one of the best tools for learning is well-aimed questions. So in this story, what is David trying to learn? David is trying to learn, how do we get this bottling plant operating more effectively? And he's going to go in there and he's going to use well-aimed questions to learn how he's going to solve this problem. So love that story. Like I said, he finally becomes COO, stepping out of his domain. How does he approach it? He knows that the answers are in other people's heads, and he's going to ask good questions to figure that out. Lesson number 8. We're going to actually read another story from the book. So this story is from when he becomes the president of KFC, which is his next move after being COO. So he's the COO of the beverage division, and then his next step in his career is he becomes the president of KFC because he does such an effective job at solving problems while he's the COO. So here we go, diving in on the book. In 1994, Wayne Calloway, chairman of PepsiCo, asked me if I would want to be the president of KFC. I pretended that I needed some time to talk it over with my family, but I knew I'd say yes. I knew Wendy would support me in that decision, and I couldn't wait to get started. When I accepted the job, I got more calls offering condolences than congratulations. Wayne asked me to take the job because I had built a reputation for helping to turn around struggling businesses, and KFC had been struggling under PepsiCo's ownership. So here we go again, back toward lesson 4, move toward the problem. David had a reputation for turning around struggling businesses. He had a reputation for diving into problems and solving them. It, being KFC, never achieved its business plan and had no same-store sales growth for 7 straight years. It became a graveyard for PepsiCo executives. To franchisees who owned 70% of the KFC restaurants, corporate was seen as a bunch of outsiders who didn't enjoy fried chicken and didn't believe KFC could beat our competitors. They also held a majority of the marketing votes, which meant they controlled everything from advertising new products, and they often voted as a bloc against us. Trust was so frayed at the time that the franchisees were suing us over territorial rights. So he's jumping into this position as the president of KFC, and from the get, they've got issues where the franchisees and corporate are not getting along, and now it's on David's shoulders to fix this problem. I'd inherited a business in decline and a broken franchise system waging open warfare with us. I started at KFC on a Monday. We had a conference with the best franchisees in the system scheduled for that Wednesday. The department heads were urging me to cancel it. Oh no, I said. I can't wait to meet these people. Even if all I accomplished was telling them I was looking forward to working with them, I was going to have that meeting. On that Wednesday, one of the first things I said was, I want you to know one thing. I love Kentucky Fried Chicken, because that's true. Then I said, look, I don't know this business, but I'm going to go through the process of learning it. I'm going to find out what the front lines are thinking, and I'm going to listen to our customers. Then I'm going to go out and share what I've learned with you. And then I'm going to ask you how to fix what's not working. Together, we're going to develop a plan to turn this business around. So I'm going to pause right there, and I want to highlight this protocol that David uses, because it's something that as I read the book, it echoes throughout it. And it's something that we just kind of talked about with the answers being in other people's heads. So similar to the story of him becoming the COO and diving in on at the bottling plant in Baltimore. Now he's taking over KFC. He doesn't know this business. How is he going to figure out how to turn it around? He says, number one, I'm going to find out what the front lines are thinking, and I'm going to listen to our customers. Number two, then I'm going to go out and share what I've learned with you. And number three, then I'm going to ask you how to fix it, or how to fix what's not working. So I love this protocol. And like I said earlier, I think this is a protocol you can use whether you're at the top of the chain of command, in the middle, or at the bottom. No matter where you are, this is a great protocol for figuring out how to tackle problems, right? And step number two, I think, ties back into simplifying things. He says, then I'm going to share with you, or share what I've learned with you. Right, that's what Jocko would call a read back. You take in all this information, you learn it. Now you need to read it back and compress that information, condense it, simplify it, and then share it back with you so that you're reading it back to the people who know the problem, and they can say, yep, you've got it, you're understanding it, or no, you're off track. This is where you need to tweak it. And then lastly, I'm going to ask you how to fix what's not working. So I love that protocol, and definitely wrote that down. I think it's worth you writing that down, or us writing that down, and taking that with us as we dive into problems in the future. All right, back to the story. This was a tough bunch, and I knew that no matter what I said, they were focused on the contract problem. So I added, I know there's a contract issue, but we can't fix this business by fighting each other. If we can't work together, there isn't going to be any business left to fight over anyways. I'm not even going to talk about the contract until we fix this business, so don't even bring it up. We started turning the business around in less than a year, in large part because we extended our trust first. We rounded up rather than rounded down, assuming franchisees were more than their most biting remarks or their most aggressive actions. And that helped them return the trust. In any relationship, business or personal, somebody has to trust more or trust first to break inertia and build up positive momentum. And then he goes into how he did this. The strategy I used, and that you can use when you're finding it hard to overcome your cynicism and shift your attitude, is to focus on shared goals. When you spend more time thinking about how you and another person or group are alike rather than how you're different, you can work around the natural tendency to consider other groups a threat. And so this is where lesson number 8 comes in, what Jocko calls climbing the ladder of alignment, which is exactly what David is doing here. So there's the corporate and there's the franchisees, and right now they have an antagonistic relationship with one another. Corporate folks are frustrated with the franchisees are frustrated with corporate. They even have a lawsuit open against corporate. And how do you approach this situation? You climb the ladder of alignment, right? And that's what David talks about here. He says focus on shared goals. At the end of the day, if you climb up, both of these organizations want and need KFC to be successful, right? So at the end of the day, they should have that common goal and should be aligned around that thing. Now, can there be disagreements below that? Yes. But at the end of the day, there's that common goal. They are aligned on what that should be, and that's what you have to refocus and reframe everybody around, is that common goal. And that's how what David says, that's how you overcome your cynicism and shift your attitude. So I think this story is just a great example of climbing the ladder of alignment to break through that inertia that's building in the negative direction and change that to be going back into the positive direction. And now, continuing this story will lead us into lesson number 9. I began shifting the attitude of everybody who worked in corporate by shocking the system, which means taking whatever conventional wisdom or prevailing attitudes are and turning them on their ear. I announced to everyone in the building, we've hated franchises for so long, it's killing us. From now on, we love franchisees. We absolutely adore them. We want to work with them. We want to learn from them, and we want them to feel the love. Why? Because we don't have a choice. I saw us as one big group with a long list of shared goals, all of us depending on each other to succeed. Besides, the franchisees are entrepreneurs. A lot of them started with nothing and worked to become multi-millionaires, owning well-run organizations that manage more than 100 restaurants. We'd have been crazy not to listen to them, learn from them, and rely on them. But first, we had to stop seeing them as the enemy. In spite of the voting bloc and in spite of the lawsuit, we had to trust them and their intentions. And that's why I had lesson number 9 was the enemy is outside the wire. That's something that I've heard Jocko say many times on, and it relates to climbing the ladder of alignment. It's easy in some situations to start having antagonistic relationships or feelings with people who are on your team, who should be moving in the same direction, right? In this case, with corporate and the franchisees, they're on the same team. They are in the wire. And remember that the enemy is outside the wire. The enemy is not your teammates who are within your company or in a different department in your company. Those people are on your team, and you've got to remember that. This is something that I've failed to do multiple times in my career, and it's important to remember the enemy is outside the wire. So whenever you see those antagonistic relationships building within an organization, climb that ladder of alignment, remember that the enemy is outside the wire, and shift the perspective and go tackle the problems so that you both can accomplish the goals that you're trying to accomplish. So those were my 9 lessons from this book, How Leaders Learn. Number 1, keep it simple. Number 2, calibrate your expectations. Number 3, failure is a part of the journey. Number 4, move toward the problems, or as McRaven would say, run to the sound of the guns. Lesson number 5, stack up undeniable proof. Evaluate the evidence of your past so that you can use that to give yourself confidence of where you're headed towards. Lesson number 6, the answers are in other people's heads. Lesson number 7, get good at asking questions. 8, climb the ladder of alignment. And 9, the enemy is outside the wire. So thank you, David, for reading this book. Like I said, I barely skimmed the surface of what David covers in this book. There's also a ton of great stories, more from David himself. He's got tons of stories in there from his own career, and he also has a bunch of really fantastic stories from other leaders in here as well. He does a great job referencing so many different CEOs and leaders of businesses and problems that they face as well. So definitely get the book. It's worth reading. He's also got a great podcast called How Leaders Lead. I've started listening to that recently. He has great guests on there. And then he also has a mobile app. I believe it's called How Leaders Lead as well. And it's just got 2-minute clips from his podcast with little leadership lessons that you can watch daily to become a better leader. So with that, thank you, David, for taking the time to share your story, share the lessons you've learned throughout your career. And like I said, I think for anyone who is looking to grow within an organization and become more effective at helping your organization win, I think this is a great book to get. So till next time, thank you for listening.